Wasteland, the 1988 game by Interplay Entertainment, specifically the team behind the then popular Bard's Tale series, is getting another sequel in the form of Wasteland 3. All I can really say is I'm glad I didn't have to wait until my mid-30s to early 40s to get a sequel to a good game like the fans of the original did. If you're unaware, Wasteland 2 by inXile Entertainment was released in 2014, a whole 26 years after the widely acclaimed and cherished original. After the slew of what you didn't know about Fallout videos came out during the Fallout 4 hype train, you probably know that the original Wasteland was a very big inspiration to the Interplay GURPS team that created Fallout. However, not many people know the parallels, what actually made it into Fallout other than the grimy post-nuclear West that the game is set in. And what else can we really thank the original Wasteland for and the legacy that it created? Well, I'm gonna answer that. The intro to the original Wasteland is the thing that really captured me. It wasn't even in the game, in the form of some kind of Ron Perlman-like narration. It was the manual. I found a PDF online, and since you're watching this, and since this is a video about the legacy of Wasteland, I should probably read it. Tensions grew with the coming of 1998. The United States' Citadel Star Station was slated to be fully operational by March. Soviet charges that the space station was merely a military launching platform alarmed a number of non-aligned nations. The right-wing governments in the South and Central Americas, many of them set up by the U.S. during the drug wars, pledged their support to the U.S. The NATO nations, including the new African members, also declared their allegiance with the U.S. That move forced most of the remaining neutral powers to join the Soviet protest. In 6 short weeks, only Switzerland, Sweden, and Ireland continued to declare themselves neutral nations. 2 weeks before Citadel was due for full operation, the station transmitted a distress signal. Immediately after the message was sent, most of the satellites orbiting the planet were swept clean from the sky, leaving the great powers blind. In military panic, each sent 90% of their nuclear arsenals skyward. Although the destruction was tremendous, it was not complete. Pockets of civilization remained, even some oblivious to the military exchange. On the same day that the US and Soviet Union were attempting to extinguish each other, a company of US Army engineers were in the southwestern deserts building transportation bridges over dry riverbeds. They worked deep in the inhospitable desert valleys, surrounded by a number of survivalist communities. Located directly south of their position on that day was a newly constructed federal prison. In addition to housing the nation's criminals condemned to death, the prison contained light industrial manufacturing facilities. Shortly after the nuclear attack began, the engineers, seeking shelter, took over the federal prison and expelled the prisoners into the desolate desert to complete their sentences. As the week passed, they invited the nearby survivalist communities to join them and to help them build a new society. Because of each community's suspicion towards one another, times were difficult at first, but as time nurtured trust, this settlement, which came to be known as Ranger Center, grew to be one of the strongest outposts. Ranger Center even proved powerful enough to repel the bands of rancorous criminals who repeatedly attacked in attempts to reclaim what was once rightfully theirs. The citizens of Ranger Center, after first believing that they were the only ones who survived the nuclear maelstrom, soon realized that communities beyond the desert's grip had also survived. Because they had such success in constructing a new community, they felt compelled to help other survivors rebuild and live in peace. Toward this end, the Desert Rangers, in the great tradition of the Texas and Arizona Rangers a century before, were born. The original Wasteland starts with you creating your party of Desert Rangers, a group whose job is to protect and help out survivors of the nuclear war. You could run with the team already provided, which is optimized to get you through the entire game, or you create your own characters, which is always more fun. I always like creating over-exaggerated versions of me and my friends and then seeing how horribly they die. If you do end up figuring out how the game really works, you'll soon find one of the most enthralling simulations of a tabletop role-playing game. In reality, Wasteland was more of a tool set that allowed you to use it to create your own story. Just this past week, as I played this game in preparation for this video, I had a really cool experience, more memorable than most of the choice and consequence situations in most modern AAA role-playing games. in which one of my most trustworthy and capable party members, Brandon, had his leg chewed off by a mutated desert lizard. He was, for a while, labeled as COM, which stands for comatose, and since we were so far away from a doctor, he soon slipped into a point of no return. He died. Born a man, died a ranger, as they say. And because I now needed room for another capable party member to fill his spot, I went out into the hot, merciless desert, and I buried him. I went to Ranger Center and created another loyal ranger who, this time, could provide medical assistance when needed. I learned my lesson. Another cool moment that I had was when I got my party stuck into a situation in which they literally could not get out of. I couldn't save and quit out of it, and the chance of evading this combat situation was zero since we were surrounded. We were stuck, looking into the eyes of death over and over again. Instead of creating a new world and completely restarting, I had an idea. I decided to use one of the tools that came with Wasteland called the Wasteland Reset tool, in which I saved the world state to a file, created a new party of characters, and placed those characters into the world state that I had saved, so that I could bring along the new set of characters into the same world that I started with. I knew this worked correctly when I brought them to a small town of Highpool, and I saw that the gravestone marking for a boy's dog was still there after my previous set of ranger characters had killed it. For the rest of the time that I had played, it felt like I was walking through the world in the shadow of a few fallen rangers, and it felt really goddamn cool. From these two small experiences that I had, I can gather two things about the original Wasteland and why people loved it so much. Not only was the story that picked up later on in the game enthralling and interesting, it also had a lot of mechanical complexities that allowed you to roleplay in more ways than just selecting dialogue. It requires you to note down passwords, graph down some maps so you don't get lost, use a character's specialty to complete objectives like using a character's brute strength to smash down a door, or perception to note some things about a room. It requires you to really use your brain and to think about how your characters are acting and why. Maybe write down a disagreement within the party in a notepad document with all of your other adventures and journeys, and then have the group split off from each other and have this cool two-phase playthrough thing going on, where one group makes different types of moral decisions than the other. I haven't even tried this yet, I just came up with this idea right now, and I know how to do it. In Wasteland, there's a party disband button that allows you to split off your group. Then, using the view button, you can switch between both of the now separated groups. And another thing that utterly amazed me about Wasteland is how it experimented with ideas that were so ahead of its time. While the first Ultima introduced the overworld concept that would, in the future, morph into the open world concept, I believe that Wasteland perfected it. Wasteland was one of the first computer role-playing games where you could save everything to a floppy, and when you loaded it back up, all of the decisions that you made, the loot that was picked up from the world, as well as story progress and choices, all stayed the same. You could continue. And the fact alone that decisions carried weight and would actually carry consequences for future gameplay was so revolutionary during its time, it almost disappoints me that its spiritual successor gets all the attention for the same thing. So, Wasteland, while still being a very clunky and archaic game, somewhere in there is a mechanical masterpiece that blends itself well with the role-playing game it's trying to be. It is, in my opinion, a great example to the answer to the question, how do you fit a social and player-oriented role-playing experience into a big dumb calculator, a machine incapable of thought and experience-making without the use of algorithmic procedural generation? The answer that Wasteland has? Make it a software tool above a game, a software tool that has a background, a story, and overarching narrative, but give the player a shitload of tools so that he or she can craft a story with them, within the game's parameters. Use simple icons and sprites to represent detailed objects and settings so that the player has enough wiggle room to come up with those objects and settings within his or her own imagination. Extend those tools beyond the computer itself. Have the player have to learn how these tools work by reading manuals and paragraphs. For example, I got sick of having to repeatedly hit the escape key to wait for my party to heal, so I set a macro that saves those 30 or so keystrokes into a single file button. And then you have the small mechanics, like setting up encounters, using a character's skill to figure out how limestone patterns on some sort of contraptions work, or choosing to use your big dumb brute strength statistic to bash open a door instead of using your thief to lockpick it. And all of this freedom and how you go about doing things with this tool set blends with the more open-ended story that it tells. Hell, even more open-ended than the original Fallout. When you start Wasteland, there's no initial start objective. You're a group of desert rangers who help people. You currently know of 2 locations, High Pool and the Agricultural Center. And you also kind of know that Vegas didn't really get hit by the nukes, which is a concept later used in Fallout New Vegas over 22 years later. But you can go and do whatever you feel like doing. Flesh out your characters, write down your adventures, gain some levels, look for supplies, flesh out your characters even more, and soon enough, subtly, a story will pick up. But ever so slowly. So slow that it's able to blend almost perfectly with any story arcs or narrative that you've already set up for your party through the tens of hours you've spent on the game. Wasteland 2 only extends on this idea, and this time with more detailed graphics, combat that encourages tactics, and a huge world that can last you about 100 hours, with all of the mechanical usability as the first. It features many things that made the first 2 Fallouts great, like its flexible character system and attributes and skills that affected dialogue. It was an interesting world with an interesting story to tell, and that fact alone makes me ever so excited for the things Wasteland 3 is going to offer, with actual multiplayer that carries consequences for all players in the party, as well as combat influenced by the modern XCOMs, in a cold, winter-like apocalyptic world. Waiting for this game almost, just almost, makes me wish for a nuclear winter. Thanks for watching.